The unmarked cargo plane touched down at Maiquetía International Airport outside Caracas just after midnight, its transponder deliberately obscured to avoid detection by American surveillance satellites that constantly monitored Venezuelan airspace. Inside the Ilyushin IL-76 were not weapons or military equipment as one might expect, but something far more valuable to the struggling Venezuelan government: 23 Russian technical advisors, encrypted communication equipment, advanced cybersecurity systems, and most importantly, detailed strategic plans that would fundamentally reshape how Venezuela defended itself against American pressure. Dr. Alexei Petrov, the mission leader and a veteran strategist from Moscow's Institute for Strategic Studies, descended the stairs into the humid Caribbean night, knowing that what his team was about to implement would catch Washington completely off guard. The strategy that Petrov and his team brought to Venezuela was the culmination of 2 years of careful study and planning in Moscow. Russian military and intelligence analysts had conducted exhaustive research into how the United States applied pressure to adversarial governments in Latin America, identifying patterns, vulnerabilities, and most importantly, blind spots in American strategic thinking. What they discovered was that while the US excelled at conventional pressure tactics like sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and support for opposition movements, American planners consistently underestimated the effectiveness of asymmetric responses that didn't fit their mental models of how conflicts should unfold. The strategy Petrov carried was designed to exploit these blind spots systematically. The core insight was deceptively simple. Venezuela couldn't compete with the United States in conventional military or economic strength, so it needed to change the nature of the competition entirely. Rather than trying to withstand American pressure through resilience alone, Venezuela would make itself simultaneously too valuable to destroy and too complicated to control. This required transforming Venezuela from an isolated pariah state into a critical node in emerging networks that powerful actors including China, Russia, Iran, and even some European nations needed or wanted to preserve for their own reasons. The strategy wasn't about making Venezuela stronger in traditional terms, but about making the costs of regime change unacceptable to enough stakeholders that American options would be constrained. The first phase of implementation focused on economic diversification away from dependence on the American-dominated financial system. For years, U.S. sanctions had targeted Venezuelan oil sales, banking access, and trade relationships, assuming this would cripple the government economically and force either collapse or capitulation. But Petrov's team helped Venezuela build alternative financial infrastructure, cryptocurrency systems for international transactions that bypassed SWIFT and American banking controls, barter arrangements with partners like Russia and Iran that exchanged oil for goods and services without dollar intermediation, and integration with Chinese payment systems that offered alternatives to Western financial dominance. These mechanisms weren't perfect or efficient by conventional standards, but they didn't need to be. They needed only to be functional enough to keep the Venezuelan government solvent and able to maintain basic state functions. The strategic goal wasn't prosperity but survival, and the new financial arrangements, while costly and complicated, achieved that objective while demonstrating to other countries under American pressure that alternatives existed. This was perhaps the most significant aspect. Venezuela became a laboratory and proof of concept for sanctions resistance that dozens of other nations watched with intense interest. The second phase addressed Venezuela's military vulnerabilities through what Russian strategists called defensive deterrence architecture. Rather than attempting to build forces capable of defeating American military intervention, which would be impossible, the strategy focused on making intervention prohibitively costly and complicated. This involved deploying advanced air defense systems that wouldn't stop American air power, but would inflict enough casualties to make operations politically difficult in Washington. It meant training irregular forces in urban warfare and insurgency tactics that would ensure any occupation faced sustained resistance. It included pre-positioning supplies and equipment for guerrilla campaigns that could last years. Most cleverly, the defensive architecture incorporated strategic ambiguity about Russian involvement in Venezuelan defense. Moscow provided training, equipment, and advisors, but carefully maintained deniability about how deeply integrated Russian personnel were with Venezuelan military systems. American planners had to account for the possibility that attacking Venezuelan targets might kill Russian advisors, potentially triggering broader conflict with a nuclear-armed power. This uncertainty functioned as a deterrent more effectively than any explicit mutual defense treaty would have, because it forced American decision-makers to make worst-case assumptions when evaluating military options. The third phase of the strategy was perhaps the most sophisticated, transforming Venezuela into an essential partner for China's Belt and Road Initiative and broader global ambitions. Beijing was offered deep-water port facilities, mining rights to substantial mineral deposits including rare earth elements, and strategic positioning for Chinese telecommunications and technology infrastructure throughout Latin America. These investments gave China concrete economic interests in Venezuelan stability, while also providing Venezuela with a powerful patron whose economic leverage over the United States exceeded what Russia alone could offer. The genius was creating a situation where American regime change in Venezuela would damage Chinese interests substantially enough that Beijing would actively work to prevent it. American analysts watching these developments from Washington initially dismissed them as desperate measures by a failing regime. The sanctions were working, they argued, evidenced by Venezuela's economic collapse, massive immigration, and obvious suffering of its population. What they missed was that the Russian strategy never aimed to prevent Venezuelan economic pain, but to ensure that economic pain didn't translate into regime change. As long as the government could maintain security forces, access enough resources to reward loyalists, and prevent organized opposition from coalescing into effective threat, economic devastation of the broader population was tragic but strategically irrelevant to regime survival. This represented a fundamental miscalculation in American strategy. Washington's pressure campaign was premised on assumption that sufficient economic pain would create internal political pressure forcing either government capitulation or popular uprising. But this model worked only when governments cared about popular welfare, or when populations had the organizational capacity and resources to mount effective resistance. The Russian strategy helped Venezuela create a system where neither condition obtained. The government insulated itself from popular pressure through repression and patronage networks, while the population was too impoverished, divided, and emigrated to organize effectively. 6 months into implementation, American intelligence agencies began reporting to the White House that something had changed in Venezuela. The government that had seemed on the verge of collapse months earlier had stabilized, not through economic recovery but through successful adaptation to the new strategic environment. CIA Director Patricia Caldwell briefed President Bradford and the National Security Council on the assessment, "Mr. President, we're seeing a level of strategic sophistication in Venezuelan responses to our pressure that didn't exist before." Russian advisors are clearly playing a significant role, but it goes beyond simple military assistance. They've helped Venezuela build resilience to sanctions, created deterrence to military intervention, and most concerning, integrated Venezuela into Chinese and Russian strategic frameworks in ways that complicate all our options. Secretary of State Margaret Chen added diplomatic dimension. "The Russians have essentially created a tripwire in Venezuela. Any serious attempt at regime change now risks confrontation not just with a weak regional power, but potentially with major rivals who have invested in keeping the current government in place. And they've done this without formal mutual defense treaties or overt military presence that would give us clear targets or justifications. It's strategically elegant precisely because it's ambiguous and asymmetric. They've changed the game while we were still playing by old rules." The revelation prompted intense debate within the administration about how to respond. Some officials argued for escalation, imposing even harsher sanctions and increasing support for opposition forces to call Russia's bluff. Others advocated for diplomatic engagement with Moscow and Beijing to negotiate some kind of settlement. Still others suggested that Venezuela simply wasn't important enough to American interests to warrant the risks of further confrontation with nuclear-armed rivals, and that accepting the new reality might be wisest course. The debate revealed deep divisions about American strategy, not just toward Venezuela, but toward managing decline in American hegemonic power more broadly. Dr. Petrov, monitoring American reactions from his secure facility outside Caracas, felt satisfaction tempered by realism. The strategy was working in that it had prevented regime change and demonstrated that American pressure could be resisted through clever asymmetric responses. But he had no illusions about what had been achieved. Venezuela remained economically devastated, its population suffering immensely, its political system repressive and dysfunctional. What Russia had helped preserve wasn't a flourishing ally, but a strategic foothold in an important region, a demonstration project, and a thorn in Washington's side. These were valuable from Moscow's perspective, but not remotely a victory for ordinary Venezuelans whose lives had not improved. The broader implications of the Russian strategy in Venezuela extended far beyond one country. Petrov knew that analysts from Iran, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, and dozens of other nations facing American pressure were studying the Venezuelan case carefully. If the techniques developed there proved transferable, Washington would face a world where sanctions and threats of intervention lost much of their coercive power. This wouldn't mean American decline into irrelevance, but it would mean the end of the post-Cold War era, when Washington could reshape governments worldwide with relatively little resistance. The Venezuelan strategy represented an early prototype of how a multipolar world order might function, with rival powers checking American dominance through clever indirect means. American strategic thinkers gradually came to appreciate what had happened, though the realization came too late to prevent Venezuela from becoming the model Petrov intended. Think tanks in Washington published retrospective analyses with titles like "How We Lost Venezuela" and "The Russian Playbook for Sanctions Resistance." These studies documented the systematic way Moscow had identified vulnerabilities in American strategy and crafted responses that neutralized them. The analyses were sophisticated and valuable, but they couldn't recover the strategic initiative that had been lost. Once alternative financial systems were built, defensive massive architectures established, and great power rivalries embedded in a regional conflict, rolling those developments back became extraordinarily difficult. The human cost of this great power maneuvering was rarely discussed in strategic analyses from Moscow, Washington, or Beijing, but it was enormous. Millions of Venezuelans had fled the country, creating refugee crisis throughout Latin America. Those who remained faced hyperinflation, shortages of basic goods, collapsed healthcare and education systems, and a repressive political environment where dissent was dangerous. The strategic game that Petrov and his counterparts in Washington played was abstractions, but for ordinary Venezuelans, it was their lives being sacrificed to geopolitical calculations made by people who would never experience the consequences. Maria Gonzalez, a nurse in Caracas who had stayed in Venezuela despite having opportunities to emigrate because she felt obligated to care for patients who couldn't leave, understood nothing of Russian strategic doctrine or American pressure campaigns. What she understood was that her hospital had no medicines, that her salary bought less each week, that patients died of preventable diseases, and that the political rhetoric from all sides rang hollow when her children went to bed hungry. The great power competition that reshaped Venezuela might have been strategic success for Moscow and strategic setback for Washington, but for people like Maria, both superpowers were equally culpable in creating conditions that made her country unlivable. The final assessment, 3 years after Petrov's team first arrived in Caracas, showed the Russian strategy had achieved its core objectives. Venezuela's government remained in power despite unprecedented American pressure. Russia had established permanent presence and influence in a region formerly dominated exclusively by Washington. China had gained strategic foothold in Latin America. American credibility and effectiveness at regime change had been damaged, with implications for U.S. power projection globally. By metrics that mattered in geopolitical terms, the operation was successful. But Petrov, writing his confidential after-action report for Moscow, included section that would never appear in public assessments. He noted that while strategic objectives were met, the human costs had been catastrophic. He observed that the preserved Venezuelan government was corrupt, repressive, and economically incompetent, meaning Russia had helped perpetuate system that brutalized its own population. He questioned whether undermining American power was worth the price paid by ordinary Venezuelans who deserved better than being pawns in great power rivalry. His superiors would ignore these observations, focused as they were on strategic competition with Washington. But Petrov felt compelled to record them anyway. Acknowledgement that strategy without morality was victory without meaning. In Washington, the Venezuela debacle prompted broader reconsideration of how America wielded power in the world. The assumption that economic pressure would reliably produce desired political outcomes had been disproven. The belief that American military superiority guaranteed ability to reshape governments had been revealed as outdated in era of asymmetric warfare and rival power involvement. The confidence that Washington could act unilaterally without consequence had been shaken by demonstration that coordinated resistance by major powers could effectively check American options. These lessons would shape American foreign policy for generation, though whether they would make that policy wiser remained open question. The Russian strategy that caught the United States off guard and reshaped Venezuela was now being studied, adapted, and potentially replicated elsewhere. Cuba received Russian advisors using similar frameworks. Nicaragua explored financial diversification techniques developed in Caracas. Belarus, Syria, and Iran all sent delegations to learn from Venezuelan experience. Moscow had created not just one-time success, but template for sanctions resistance and deterrence that could be applied wherever Russian interests aligned with preserving regimes under American pressure. This multiplication of the strategy was perhaps its ultimate success from Russian perspective, but it also meant multiplication of human suffering as more populations became caught in great power competitions they couldn't escape. The Caribbean sunset painted the sky over Caracas in brilliant orange and purple as Petrov prepared to return to Moscow, his mission accomplished and his replacement already embedded in the Venezuelan strategic apparatus. He stood on the balcony of his secure facility watching the city below, its lights flickering unreliably due to electrical failures, its streets dangerous after dark, its people struggling to survive an economy his strategies had helped keep dysfunctional. He felt pride in having executed his mission successfully, having outsmarted American strategists and demonstrated Russian strategic creativity. But he also felt weight of knowing that strategic victories counted in Moscow were tragedies counted in lives disrupted, potentials unrealized, and suffering prolonged in service of geopolitical games where ordinary people never had a say.